One of the most common arguments you will encounter against writing formal verse is, it's been done. Now, while this technically is not wrong, it is misleading. The fact is that there are hundreds of poetic forms in existence that have been around for a very long time, and the possibilities for doing something new with those forms is literally endless. And to illustrate this fact, I just want to focus on one form here. I want to talk about that iconic form, the sonnet. Now, this is far too large a subject to discuss in detail, so this is going to be more of an outline. I will give a history of the form's development, both past and present, and then I will talk about the method of writing the volta, or turn, and give a basic crash course in iambic pentameter. First, a brief history of the sonnet. Now, the sonnet has had a very long life. It was invented by a Sicilian poet, Giacomo da Lentini, in the 13th century, and over the next 3 centuries or so it crystallized into a few different forms. In Italy, where it began, Francesco Petrarch lent his name to what has become known as the Petrarchan sonnet. This is 14 lines with a rhyme scheme, A-B-B-A, A-B-B-A, and then some combination of C-D-E rhymes. CDE, CDE is the most common, but there are about half a dozen standard variations on this. It has 2 stanzas, each organized into an octet and sestet, a group of 8 lines and 6. Then, up in England, Thomas Wyatt and Henry Howard imported the Petrarchan sonnet and did their own variations on it. Half a century later, Shakespeare lent his name to the Shakespearean sonnet, not because he invented it, but because he is its best practitioner. It consists of 14 lines of iambic pentameter, rhyming A-B-A-B, C-D-C-D, E-F-E-F, G-G. Now, in addition to these 2, there exists a third classic sonnet type, known as the Scottish sonnet. Like the other 2, it is also associated with a specific individual, in this case, Edmund Spenser, who, again, didn't invent it, but is the most famous early practitioner of this form. Now, this has an interlocked rhyme scheme of ABAB, BCBC, CDCD, EE. So 4 B and C rhymes instead of 2, which makes it a little more difficult. So those are the 3 classic types. Now, if we jump forward a little bit to the 19th century, we get another variation, the terza rima sonnet created by the Romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. This is where you take the rhyme scheme started by Dante in his Divine Comedy, so this sonnet's organization differs slightly as a result. Instead of 3 4-line stanzas preceding the couplet, you have 4 3-line stanzas, and the couplet concludes the rhyme scheme begun in the middle line of the previous stanza. And of course there have been even further innovations since this time. This includes the extended or stretched sonnet, which extends the sonnet to 16 lines instead of 14, as developed by George Meredith. Gerard Manley Hopkins, a great innovator, developed 2 innovations. The caudate sonnet, which adds codas or tails to the 14 lines, and he also developed the curtal sonnet. Now, if we look at his poem, Pied Beauty, this is a shortened version of the sonnet where the 2 quatrains in the octet are instead 2 tercets, so 3 lines instead of 4. And instead of the second sestet, we have 4.5 lines. And then that last line is just 1 foot. Praise him. So it's less 4.5 lines than 4 1/5 lines. And then we come to the granddaddy of sonnets, the sonnet crown. This is where a sequence of sonnets are linked by repetition. The last line of one sonnet is used as the first line of the next, and this will culminate in a final sonnet called a heroic crown or sonnet redoublé, where the last sonnet is composed of the first lines of the previous ones. So usually because the master sonnet has to be 14 lines, the crown of sonnets is usually a 15 sonnet sequence, but sometimes not. John Donne's La Corona is an example of this. Donne wrote 7 sonnets, and the last line of the 7th is also the first line of the first. There is in fact very little that has not been done with the sonnet, but I'm going to focus on 3 recent examples I've encountered that have been developed by poets living today. The first poem, Swoon, is by Susan Jarvis Bryant from her collection, fern-feathered edges. This is a sonnet in monometer, which means that instead of 5 iambic feet per line, there is only 1 foot per line, consisting of 2 syllables, ba-bum.
The moon unfurls, a bloom of pearls ignites the sky, excites my eye, with beams so bold in dreams untold of you, in blue.
Lovely, passionate, and original.
I should add that the monometer sonnet was not developed by Bryant herself, but by the poet James Tweedy, a remarkably inventive poet who has made a number of innovations in a variety of forms, and someday certainly deserves his own video on this.
Second, we have Red Flags, a sestina sonnet written by Joshua C. Frank. Now, this combines the sonnet with the sestina, where each stanza cycles through the same end rhymes, but switches up their order. Now, usually the sestina has 6 stanzas of 6 lines and then a final triplet, but in this case it's 3 stanzas of 4 lines and a final couplet. So we cycle through lands, sunset, prison, and away, and then in the final couplet, all 4 also repeat. Away in prison, and in the last line, the lands, sunset. It's very cleverly done. Now, maybe you're a person of a more liberal disposition and you don't care for the social message of the poem, but it's not to my point here to highlight the content, only the form. Third, we have a haiku sonnet, a synthesis between the haiku and the sonnet, which was developed by me, actually. Or at least, that's what I thought. As it turns out, the haiku sonnet was invented more than 20 years ago by a poet named David Marshall. And not knowing this, I wrote mine thinking that I was the first person to do it, which I was not. And this should come as no surprise because there is nothing new under the sun, as the cliche goes. Now, David Marshall's versions of the haiku sonnet, although they're perfectly good poems, other than having 14 lines with haiku stanzas, he doesn't really follow any of the standard rules of either the haiku or the sonnet. So in case you weren't aware, when you're writing Japanese haiku, there's actually a lot of different rules that you're supposed to follow. One, haiku are supposed to be about nature, not people. They're also supposed to employ a seasonal word, be in the present tense, and have a twist in the third line, which mirrors the volta of the sonnet. So, when I was writing my haiku sonnet, I tried to follow the rules of both forms, which made it really difficult because that's a lot of different things that you have to keep in your head at once. Now, because the stanzas are haiku, they're not pentameter lines, so 14 lines, each 3-line stanza consists of 17 syllables, 5, 7, 5. Standard haiku form, but they also rhyme at the end, and they use the terza rima form to do this, a la Shelley. And the final couplet is also 17 syllables, the first line having 2 sets of 5 syllables each, with a pause in the middle, and then 7 in the second line. Now, when David Marshall did this, he actually had a better solution to this, whereas I was trying to squeeze 17 syllables into 2 lines. His final couplets were 7 and 7, or you could just do a couplet of 5 and 7, and that's more appropriate, I think. My final couplet was kind of a bit of a mess. But when you're trying to develop something new, or at least so I thought, there's always going to be a lot of playing around with things. So these are just a few modern examples of sonnet variations. I could go on, there's a lot more, but I think you get the point. Now I want to talk about one very important aspect of the sonnet that every sonnet has, no matter what the form is, and that is the volta, which means turn in Italian. This is a rhetorical shift that occurs, a dramatic change in thought or in emotion. In a Petrarchan sonnet, the volta usually happens at the 9th line between the octave and the sestet. For example, the octave might introduce a problem or theme, and the sestet offers a response or a solution. Now, I myself once wrote a Petrarchan sonnet, if it's not too much to talk about another one of my poems that I wrote. I begin, each wing delivers news of a young earth. And then I go through a catalogue of birds and nature imagery. The nightingale, the end of moonless woes. The dove, the peace of melting mountain snows. The hummingbird, the goldfinch, the starling, etc. Beautiful imagery, if a bit conventional. And then in the sestet, I begin, then feathers flutter in the headlights' glare. No messengers are heard, no chirp or trill. And so the volta occurs here with the poem shifting perspectives from birds flying around in nature to birds getting hit by cars, ending with the line, "My happiness was flattened to roadkill." Not what you were expecting when you started reading the poem. And that's the point. Now, the Shakespearean or English sonnet is a little bit different. The volta could occur in the ninth line at the beginning of the third stanza, or it might occur in the final couplet. One of the most famous examples of this is, of course, Shakespeare's sonnet, "My mistress' eyes were nothing like the sun." Shakespeare goes through a catalog of apparent insults, saying that her body parts aren't as good as anything he's comparing them to, and then you have that magical final turn. "And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare." So again, the function of the volta is, to reiterate, creating a sense of contrast or opposition. It signals a shift from one idea to its opposite. Maybe you're moving from despair to hope, or vice versa, hope to despair, as I did in my Petrarch sonnet. Maybe you start out in a sense of confusion and you're moving towards clarity. And this contrast is going to combine with a sense of surprise or an unexpected resolution that adds some new insight on the subject and deepens the reader's awareness.
So, that's 800 years in 12 minutes. I wanted to do 800 years in 8 minutes, but I couldn't because I started talking about myself. Join me next time for part 2 of this tutorial, where I will be giving a basic crash course in iambic pentameter and, most importantly, how to do some standard variations on the pentameter line. Thank you.